Hello. Our project is a game called Last Alert. The genre of game we wanted to make was a timed scavenger hunt like game, where you have to find objects in the scene and bring them to an area while solving little puzzles along the way. When deciding on themes and ideas for our game, we settled on having it take place in a space station. The motive behind finding the objects is that there is a meteor on course to collide with the station. The player must find the objects needed to finish a broken escape pod and escape before the time is up. Our Sprint 1 goal is to create a rough looking tutorial scene with all the base functionality needed to move and look around, to pick up and drop items, to save the game, and finally allow the user to lose or win the game. We also wanted to make sure we had the basic menu screens, such as the Home and Settings menu, to navigate through. We define a user story as done if it has an acceptance test, has been coded or created, is well documented, follows proper coding conventions, is bug-free, has been tested, and the team unanimously agrees the story is complete.
Hi, I'm Kieran, and I'm part of the development team, and the main parts I focus on the sprint were the player and the winning system. For the player, I designed and programmed how the player moves, looks, and interacts with the scene. The player movement and looking controls were pretty simple to program, but I underestimated the amount of time I needed to program in how the user interacts with the scene. For the winning system, I designed a win controller, which would take in multiple types of completion scripts. Each would check if something was completed, and then the win controller would then tell the game when all tasks are done. I designed these completion scripts to be easy for the scene designers to implement to save time and so they have as much flexibility as possible. These scenes can also be used to trigger events, such as a door opening. One thing I would change during the next sprint is allowing the win controller to take in these events rather than checking if all the completion scripts are completed.
I'm Caitlin, and I'm part of the development team as well as being the Scrum Master. My focus this sprint was on the UI for the game. This included the home menu, the pause screen, the settings, and the player overlay. The home and pause menus were fairly straightforward, requiring me to add buttons to take you to different screens and then writing the code to make them actually function, while also making the background and general layout fit with our UI designs. For the pause screen specifically, I needed to work a little with Kieran, who was coding the actual pause function for the game, so that when the player paused the game, the pause screen would appear. The settings was my more complicated story. At first, I needed to build the UI itself, which involved learning how scrolling UIs are done in Unity. What made this story more difficult, however, was that I needed to implement the changing of the different settings, such as the key bindings. As the volume and mouse sensitivity were both things pertaining to Max's stories, he wrote the code for the implementing of those two sliders. For the player overlay, I created the shapes for the helmet overlay and downloaded them into a PNG to keep the background transparent. I then added the images to the player's camera UI and created a quick animation for the timer to drop down once it is needed, as we only wanted it to appear in the levels after the tutorial.
I'm Toby, and I'm part of the development team. In this sprint, I focused on level design and construction, as well as guiding the player through the tutorial. While designing the tutorial, I needed to think about every aspect of our game that the player would interact with, and create a scenario that would require the player to use each one in order to progress through the level. This meant communicating with the rest of the team about what features were being implemented in the sprint and how each of them would work. I also needed to make sure that the player knew what they needed to do at each stage of the tutorial. This meant going through the tutorial, pretending I had no experience with computer games at all, and taking note of where I would have a hard time progressing. When I found that new players would get stuck, I made text on a wall that would tell them how to continue. These instructions had to be put in places that would allow the player to see them when they needed that particular information, and so that the player didn't have to search for the way forward. The only part that wasn't designed to be very obvious was the final section, as that was an introduction to the object-based puzzles they would find in the game. I tried to make the solution to this first problem relatively easy to find without simply telling the player how to solve it. We planned to have another type of puzzle that would be connected to the keypad. I realized I wouldn't have time to implement this in this sprint, so that was moved to sprint 2.
My name is Max, and I am part of the developer team and the product owner. My main objective in this sprint was creating load and save functions as well as the audio manager. As a team, we decided that it would be important that the game should be saved at certain checkpoints. This would allow the players to leave and not worry about losing their progress. The intended purpose of this is whenever you close the game via the menu quit button, you can reopen the game and press continue to put you back at the last checkpoint. This also works well when the game unexpectedly crashes. I had to do a bit of upskilling to understand how to read and write formatted binary files correctly in Unity, but when that was done, the development went smoothly. Including music is always good for games, so one of my user stories I was assigned was to include ambient music in the game. Whether this user story was essential was debated, but we decided that making an audio manager would be an important part of the base functionality to then build upon in Sprint 2. When developing this, I had a small problem. When moving between scenes, the audio would restart. This caused the audio to jump to the beginning, and this was solved by making the object persist between scenes.
We believe our team worked well together. We all hung out outside of class, which helped with making our conversations more natural and casual, rather than shy and awkward. There were still a few moments when our individual code didn't quite link up correctly. However, we learnt quickly the importance of communication, as our GitHub conflicts were very annoying to fix, and we wanted to minimize as much of them as possible.
Our Sprint 1 burndown chat started off slow since we had assignments in other classes due all around the same time, but after that we managed to get back on track. In our 11th daily stand-up, we realized that we wanted to add the player overlay, but that it didn't fit into any one story, and so we decided to add it as a new story as we thought it was important enough for our team to justify adding it in, which explains the small peak upwards. Something that we noticed coming to the end of the sprint was that we were a little bit behind our ideal work trend, but we pulled it together and managed to finish all of our user stories. Another thing that also contributed to our burndown chat trend was that we had an imbalance in the distribution of points in our user stories, and we ended up completing 2 stories with the largest amount of points last. In the next sprint, we want to take a look at all the user stories and see if any of them need to be split up into smaller stories. We'll also take a look at all the points and make sure they're all well balanced.
During the development of each user story, whoever was assigned the story would move the Trello card to our development column and start working on it. If, while developing the story, they had a problem or something that needed clarification, then they would bring it up with the group and would either all look into it together, or someone with more knowledge in that field would work with the developer. Once the story's developer thought they had completed all they needed to, they would move the story card into the testing column and notify the assigned tester on our Discord server that it was ready for testing. If the tester found that it was complete, they would mark it as done, otherwise the card would be moved back into development. Then finally, the tester would again notify the group of the change, and if anyone had any objections, they could speak.
Thanks for watching.